There we come. Welcome, everybody. We'll start right at the top of the hour, whatever that hour is where you are. It's going to be 3 o'clock for me. If you would like, if you could please type in the chat box where you are located, that will help us to know where you are. If you are a Kentucky agent looking for credit, you need to sign in the chat when you get here, and you need to sign out before I close down so that I can say for certain that you are here from start to end in order for you to get your continuing education credits. We have 1 more minute. I'm sure there'll be a few more. Some of the names I recognize as multiple people. I'm expecting a few more. Okay, well, while we're waiting for the last minute people to join us, I see we have somebody from Minnesota, somebody from North Carolina, and David from Kentucky. You need to sign in, say you're here, so I can verify that you are participating. My name is Dr. Jacquie Jacob. I am at the University of Kentucky, where I'm one of 2 poultry specialists. As part of my job, I also coordinate what we call the community of practice for e-extension, which is the electronic version of the National Cooperative Extension Service. We have a program that specifically targets small and backyard flocks. So we do monthly webinars. We have been doing monthly webinars for many years now. All of our webinars, including this one, are recorded. All the recordings are posted on both our YouTube channel and on e-extension, so you're free to watch any of the recordings from past webinars. We also link to it from our project page, which I will put in the chat once I have introduced our speaker. So during the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box. If you have a question, feel free to type it in. If you're like me, you forget the question. If you don't, type it in when you think of it. If the question is a clarification of something the speaker is speaking about at that time, I will pop up and interrupt for the clarification. Otherwise, we'll hold questions to the end to not, get the speaker off their train of thought. So for today's webinar, we're very lucky. We have Dr. David Frame from Utah State University. He has done presentations for us before. He's an excellent presenter, and you can see many of his past webinars recordings on our website, where he talks a lot on poultry diseases. And today he's going to be discussing respiratory issues in birds, in poultry. And so hopefully that you'll get a lot of good information. And again, if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll either interrupt and get a clarification or hold them to the end. So Dr. Frame, if you would like to share your PowerPoint, I'll put myself on mute, and you can do your presentation. Again, any University of Kentucky or Kentucky State agents that are on here wanting credit, if you can put your name and county in the chat box to verify that you are here. Okay, I am going to put myself, whoops, I need to get out of on mute. My video will be stopped. If I pop back up again, it's to get a clarification.
Well, thank you, Jackie, and welcome everyone to this Pandora's box of diseases that we talk about in respiratory issues in poultry. My name is David Frame. I'm the Extension Poultry Specialist for Utah State University, and I am board certified in the American College of Poultry Veterinarians and did my residency at the University of California at Davis. And I've been involved professionally since that time in poultry veterinary work. And so hopefully I can give you a few suggestions today on some very difficult things to deal with in poultry. And the first thing we need to talk about, and I think you've probably have looked at this, and if not, go back to the anatomy lesson and also the necropsy webinar, and that might help you out. But we're going to talk a little bit about the respiratory system anatomically in birds first. And birds have a couple of unique things. Well, they've got more than that, but at least three things that deal with the respiratory system. And the first one is that they don't have a diaphragm. And so the pressure that's in their abdomen and in their thorax is the same. And so they breathe differently than us. They move the air in and out of their respiratory system by the use of their keel and muscle areas, so that it kind of acts as a bellows. Now, maybe if we can orient ourselves, this is actually the beginning of the windpipe right here. This is all teased out. And then this is the trachea where the air comes down. And what we're looking at is just one side. The exact same thing happens over here. But what I want to bring to your attention are two things. The red area is the lung of the bird. It's placed up in the between the ribs, actually, up above, and it doesn't move. It doesn't expand and contract like ours does. Ours is more like a balloon where you breathe in and it expands, and then you breathe out and it doesn't. So the air moves through the lung and goes into what's called air sacs. And these air sacs don't have a lot of vascularity to them. There's not a lot of blood vessels in them, but the air goes through the lung and goes or into the air sac, either thing. And then on expiration, the air goes from the air sacs back into the lungs. And so it's kind of a one-way trip for the air, although there is some turbulence and things do mix a little bit. But that's a very efficient way of extracting the oxygen and getting rid of the carbon dioxide. And that's the reason why birds can fly so fast and so high, is they do have an efficient system. The air sac, let me just show you here. This is a picture of a pigeon, and you can see that the lung up here is right up underneath the ribs, right against the back. It doesn't move much. And we have sets of air sacs on both sides. Some of them are single, but most of them are double. And so that air, these sacs fill with air, and they act as storage vessels. Now, anatomically, they cause us some problems with disease too, because things that go down into these air sacs, if you have a lot of dust or you have a lot of bacteria and things like that, they don't clear out of here very easily. And so we can have some real problems with respiratory diseases simply because the air sacs are not vascular. They can't clear things. However, if they get irritated, blood vessels will start to occur, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But first, I want to show you what a good air sac looks like. It's clean, it's clear. You can basically read a newspaper through it. And so these filmy areas right here are what the air sacs are. Of course, some of it has been torn as the bird has been opened up. But the other thing I want to bring to your attention as we get to it later is the lung is a bright orange color. That's a normal lung. That's what it should look like. And you can see that it's tucked up in there. There's not a lot of movement of it. Now, when irritations get down into these air sacs, you can have some real problems. And I just want to show you what happens when that occurs. Those air sacs are no longer clear and being able to read newspaper through them. Notice how they're starting to get some vessels that are trying to fight the infection. And you can get what's called an air saculitis. This can be caused by a number of things. E. coli is a great secondary pathogen that can get down into the air sacs and into the lungs. It's usually opportunistic, so it comes in off of other things, and so it's usually not the primary reason for it. In this case, this is actually Ornithobacterium rhinotracheale in turkeys, but a lot of things will cause this inflammation and so forth. So you want to keep that in mind, particularly when you're putting your birds in environmental conditions. You don't want ammonia or dust or things like that to overwhelm them. And then the part of the respiratory system that often gives us trouble too are the sinuses. This is a cross section of a pheasant, actually. But what I want to bring to your attention are these infraorbital sinuses. They're just kind of blind pouches down in there. They can collect a lot of stuff through gravity. And once it gets down in there, it's really hard sometimes to get that out. And you can end up with swollen sinuses. And there's a number of diseases that cause swollen sinuses. And as we go through this presentation, I just want you to kind of make a mental note of some of the things that could cause those sinuses to swell up. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty of things, and there's some possible causes for respiratory disease. This isn't an exhaustive list. What I'm going to visit with you about today are mainly things that are in turkeys and in chickens, and game birds too. But some of these diseases occur only in certain species, and as we get to those, I'll mention that and make sure that we understand that. The ammonia and dust are probably the two most common ones, particularly during the wintertime when folks start trying to keep their chickens out of the cold and the snow and everything. There's a tendency to maybe button them up a little too tight, and the air doesn't move as well as it should. You get some ammonia buildup in there or some dust, and this can cause some air saculitis problems and also some sinus problems too. The first disease that we'll talk about is Mycoplasma gallisepticum. Oftentimes in the literature, it's referred to as chronic respiratory disease, or MG. And this is one that is a kind of a bacterial type organism that once birds are infected with it, they don't clear it. They hold on to it for the rest of their life. Another one we'll talk about is infectious laryngeal tracheitis. This is the viral disease. It's in the herpes virus family. It's a gallid herpes virus. And we'll talk some of the specifics on that. Also infectious bronchitis, which is a coronavirus, very interestingly. It's in a whole different branch from the coronavirus that's causing our COVID problems in human beings right now. Nonetheless, it is something that we have learned a lot about the coronaviruses because of that, particularly the poultry veterinarians. We had some ideas on what the COVID would do before some of the other people even, and sure enough, things are coming to pass about the way that you would expect a coronavirus to act. Newcastle disease is a paramyxovirus. It is a zoonotic disease. It can infect human beings. It usually causes just a eye infection, just a mild infection there, but you have to watch out for that. Infectious coryza is a bacterial disease, Avibacterium paragallinarum. This is one that can affect chickens. Newcastle disease can affect either chickens or turkeys. Infectious bronchitis is strictly a chicken pathogen, and infectious laryngeal tracheitis is also chickens. Mycoplasma gallisepticum can infect virtually all poultry, game birds, chickens, turkeys, quail, and so forth. One thing that also that we have to be aware of is avian influenza. The low-path avian influenza viruses can cause some respiratory disease. Usually, if it's high-path, like what went through the United States this last couple of years, it's so virulent that it kills things before they even have a chance to show any respiratory infections or signs. Bordetellosis or turkey coryza is caused by Bordetella avium. Any of you that might have had a dog with kennel cough, that is a Bordetella also, and you realize that that was not as easily treated as you would think, and the same thing with turkey coryza. It's a tough one to deal with. Then our last respiratory problem that we'll deal with is Syngamous trachea, which is often known as the gapeworm. This occurs in certain areas of the country. It doesn't occur too much where I live, but in other areas of the country, you can see it. So let's start with Mycoplasmic allocepticum, or MG. This is probably fairly common in small and home flocks. Chickens usually don't show signs of it, and they get along pretty well. There may be a slight drop in egg production, but if you just have a few chickens, you may not even notice it. The big problem here is that if you have mixed flocks with turkeys, these chickens can transfer that organism to the turkeys, and turkeys will show signs of it, and will have swollen sinuses and some deep respiratory problems too eventually. It usually manifests as a snick, a head shake, or a slight mucus discharge from the nostrils in chickens if they do become stressed and they have it. However, all strains are pathogenic to turkeys, and so there's different strains that may not cause any problems in chickens. There's strains that may show slight problems, but all strains, regardless if they're in chickens or turkeys, are going to show some signs, some bad signs in turkeys. Here's an example of a swollen sinus from Mycoplasma. There's nasal discharge there. The turkey's having a hard time breathing because by this time it's down into its air sac, and you can notice that its eye is kind of an almond shaped because of the infection around it. Here is a outbreak in some heritage turkeys that occurred in Utah here. And this is very typical of what a turkey with MG looks like. It almost looks like just these bell-shaped balloon type things underneath the eyes. There's a lot of sneezing sometimes. You can see the feed and litter that's collected around from the nostrils and the nasal discharge there. So this is a pretty severe case in some heritage birds. Now, infectious bronchitis, I don't have anything to show you on infectious bronchitis or on just regular Newcastle disease, because normally the birds look fine, at least to the cameras. What goes on down inside the tracheas and things, they can have some coughing and other respiratory problems that are evident when you necropsy them, but just to look at a bird with infectious bronchitis, it doesn't really tell you much. The only way you can really distinguish it is by laboratory testing. And Newcastle disease will manifest itself very commonly, just like infectious bronchitis. And so you have to take them to the lab, and they have to do tests on them. And sometimes you have a dual infection of them. Now, infectious bronchitis is likely quite prevalent in home chicken flocks. I don't know in other areas of the country, but at least in Utah, we have done surveys and found that there's a lot of infectious bronchitis viruses that are floating around in just backyard flocks, and even some of the exhibition flocks too.
David, I just wanted to ask a question. It's not something somebody typed in, but I get questions all the time. When you said testing, take it to a lab for testing, that you mean necropsy, right? Because I get a lot of questions. Is there a blood test I can do for my chicken to see if it has a certain disease? Because it's a pet, they don't want it to die. So when you say take it to the lab for testing, it's not coming back, right?
Okay, that's a good point, because when I speak of lab, I mean a poultry diagnostic lab, and what comes in the front door does not come out the back door. However, there are some tests that can be done to maybe give you some idea if they've been exposed to these diseases. However, with single birds, it's very seldom capable of saying, okay, this is what's really the problem. If you have a flock of say 200 chickens, you can bleed say 30 of them. Take those samples to the lab, the blood samples. You don't have to take the birds themselves, and they can do some ELISA testing and some other things to give you some idea if they've been exposed to either infectious bronchitis or Newcastle disease, and maybe some other diseases too. But again, that's something that you don't just want to drop your chicken off the diagnostic lab and expect to come pick it up in a couple of hours. Good point. So as I was saying, I think it's more prevalent in home flocks of chickens than we really know about. There hasn't been a lot of studies doing that, and I was surprised when we did ours. Now, vaccine is available. However, it's rarely feasible because, first of all, you have to know the serotype of the bronchitis virus that's infecting your birds, because some vaccines will work better than others. And they also come in large quantities, and so if you have 2 or 3 chickens to vaccinate, it's rarely feasible. And with some TLC, those birds will, if they're not secondarily infected, will usually get over it, and then they're immune. But if you have some real problems and you have a flock that's important, particularly for egg production, then you might consider vaccination. And bronchitis viruses don't just affect the respiratory system, they also affect the reproductive system to a point. And it's really interesting because they can damage the oviduct, and you'll start getting misshapen eggs, and also a lot of creases in them, and some thin-shelled and no-shelled eggs. Now, I'm not talking about the occasional one that occurs out there. We all get those in our birds, but if you all of a sudden have a bunch of eggs that look like this, I would be considering either bronchitis or Newcastle as a possibility. And it also affects the internal quality of the egg too. And so you're not going to get the thick albumin holding the yolk up as well, and so forth. They're edible. They're not going to cause any problems, but they're not a very good quality. Newcastle disease is, again, clinically indistinguishable. You got to go test them. Now, vaccination is possible, but you've got to know what you're doing when you do it. They're live vaccines, and so you can cause more of a problem than you're trying to solve if you're not careful. And so be sure to work with a poultry veterinarian or somebody who knows, has had experience with this, because you don't want to cause a problem. With the caveat that virulent Newcastle disease is considered a foreign animal disease, and that's taken care of by stamping out. You depopulate everything. Now, when virulent Newcastle disease comes in, again, you're rarely going to have any respiratory problems that are long-lasting, because it kills the chickens very rapidly. In fact, here's a case of a game fowl producer in Utah that had actually brought some chickens from California in that had it, and his operation was so bad that he finally called the state veterinarian up, and we went out there and checked this thing out, and almost all his birds had died by the time we checked them out. We had 1,400 pounds of birds that we took to a designated landfill. And so with virulent Newcastle disease, it's not going to last very long, and it is reportable too. Let's see, we're talking here. I can't read the top of my screen. Oh, this is infectious laryngotracheitis. And one of the hallmarks of ILT is that there's gasping, and the birds will be unable to stand. And the reason they're gasping is because the trachea is actually decomposing, and you get all this necrotic debris in the trachea, and it'll cause plugs. It gets down at the bottom of the trachea where it goes into the bronchi, and it can actually stick there, and then the bird suffocates because it can't breathe through there. And that's what this gasping is. It's trying to trying to get the air down through there. This is really a disease you don't want to deal with. However, for you that show chickens, be awfully careful about this, because there are some people that will vaccinate out there underground. And if they use the wrong kind of vaccine and bring their birds to the show, you can bring your chickens to the show, then take them home. And if they're not quarantined and everything that you normally would want to do, you can have some problems with this bringing it back. So be careful. And in most states, field outbreaks of this are reportable to the state veterinarian. I know they are in Utah, and they probably are in most states. So this is a regulated disease.
When you say underground vaccination, that's because using the vaccine has to be through your state veterinarian, right?
Yes, right. And so they just go off on the internet somewhere, pick up somewhere, and do it without any permission or things like that, and then taking them to the show. So watch out for that if you're showing birds. It's typically slow spreading in a flock. Mortality is by suffocation, as I mentioned, and vaccines are available, but most will require the approval from a state veterinarian. But you have to know what you're doing, because you can get what's called rolling reactions in there. And so the vaccine itself will actually start causing some problems and roll through the flock. And then if you have other chickens there that are different ages, and you don't completely depopulate, you can establish an infection that continues on there. It's important to rule out avian influenza by PCR on this, but AI usually spreads rapidly and so forth. But with small flocks or ones that aren't valuable breeders or pets, you may just want to get rid of the whole flock once you get it, so that you don't have these rolling reactions. This is typical of what a bird will look like. It's a pump handle type action on the neck as it's trying to gasp. It'll gasp upward. Notice that it's down on its legs. You open that up, and that trachea is not what probably Jackie showed you what a trachea looks like on the anatomy lesson. You can see that it's very reddened. There's a lot of inflammation going on in there. And when you open it up, there's a lot of debris inside, and the tracheal lining is actually sloughing off, and the virus gets down in there and causes this kind of a problem. And this is actually a case from a vaccine reaction. With field outbreaks, you're usually seeing a lot more yellow stuff that's going down the trachea and things. So you can have some real problems with this. Infectious coryza is sometimes a localized disease in some areas of the country. It's around, in other areas it's not found so much. Again, one of the big problems here is that you can bring this home from shows if you're not careful. And even though infectious coryza is not very common in Utah, I used to show birds, and I took my birds to the show and brought them home and didn't do what everyone should do, and that's quarantine those birds for 3 weeks, threw them back in the coop with the rest of my birds, and before long I had a terrible problem. Mortality can get up to 40%, and you just get this sinus swelling, and there's a discharge out of the nostrils that once you smell that, you'll never forget it, and it just permeated the whole coop. And you have to have really a cultural sensitivity on that to be able to know what to use for antibiotics. And of course, you'd have to get your veterinarian involved there too. Once the birds recover, though, the ones that do recover, they harbor the organism for life. There's typhoid Mary, and this has nothing to do with chickens. But I put this URL in there. If you want to learn about Mary Mallon and why she's called Typhoid Mary, that's a good article to read. So anyway, basically what that means is that wherever the bird goes, it can shed that organism. And if you have chickens that have never been infected or exposed to coryza before, they can become sick. Again, here's a picture. It has a tendency to be towards the front, although at the bottom, the infraorbital sinus can also be affected. And this picture does not depict the smell that comes out of these birds, but it's very characteristic. Avian influenza, we're not going to talk a lot about that today. However, there are different pathotypes of influenza. Some of them are high path. They're the H5s and the H7s that are either high path or have the potential of becoming high path. These quickly kill things, and these are the ones that the government gets involved in, and depopulation and everything like that. They can infect basically any kind of bird you can think of, and so the low path AI or other influenza viruses that are not either H5 or H7 or some of these other H's, they can infect domestic poultry and a lot of times cause no signs at all. The only reason you'd know that they were exposed to it maybe if you took a blood test. However, that's in chickens. In turkeys, it doesn't matter if it's high path or low path. All avian influenza viruses are bad in turkeys, and you can get swollen sinuses and nasal discharge, and you'd swear these birds have MG, and it's actually a low path AI. I've seen that a number of times. Now, this is a turkey disease. We're going to talk about turkey coryza, and don't confuse this with infectious coryza, which is an aviobacterium. Infectious coryza can only infect chickens. This Bordetella is another completely different type of organism, and so turkey coryza infects turkeys. Now, with a caveat, there are some cases where Bordetella avium is now getting into some broiler flocks and things like that, some chickens, so it's starting to cross over a little bit. Usually it's a disease of young birds, 4 to 6 weeks old, young poults. Now, you have signs include snicking, and for you who don't know what snicking is, it's kind of a sound that the birds will make. There's coughing, deep gurgle, crusting on the eyelids, and mucus stains on the feathers of the wings and back. That'll tell you that you've got a problem. Now, you can have some high mortality with this if E. coli or other secondary pathogens get involved, and so you want to be watching for that. Now, vaccines are available, but may not be readily accessible. And I know there's at least one commercial vaccine out there, but again, this is a disease that will cause not so much swollen sinuses, but some nasal discharge. And maybe you can appreciate a little bit, these feathers are matted back here and they're kind of a golden color. The poults will put their head back on their back and on their wings and scratch their eyes and scratch the mucus out of their noses, and then it accumulates on the back. And again, if it's secondarily infected, it can cause some pretty bad air sacculitis and other problems there. Okay, here's a good picture of a tracheal plug. This occurs with Bordetella, and particularly if there's secondary infection, it'll weaken the tracheal rings and cartilage in there quite a bit. And so that's one thing that you can diagnose and see that. But this tracheal plug they'll die of suffocation. Now, if any of you raise bobwhite quail out there, there's a disease called quail bronchitis that is terrible. It's also a viral disease, and you can have up to 90% mortality in there because of tracheal plugs. The virus gets in the trachea, sloughs it off, and get down in there. So that's not a very good disease too. So there's a number of things that can cause tracheal plugs too. Now, fowl cholera is a disease that's not necessarily always a respiratory problem. It affects many systems of the body, but we were talking about it today as a respiratory problem. And death is often associated with the toxins that the bacterium, which is Pasteurella multicida, make. And once it gets into the bloodstream, you can have some dead birds. Turkeys are often susceptible. Chickens are susceptible too, but turkeys particularly will have problems, especially if they're stressed. In some areas of the country, we have a lot of different, or a big difference between daytime highs and nighttime lows. And this is a stress on them that often will bring out cholera in turkeys. And so other weather conditions can do the same. if there's a lot of dust in the environment, that can often be a stress factor too. But the most common indication is increasing death in the flock. It's not like like overnight you may lose 5 and then the next day 10 and the next day 50 type things. It's not goes into double digits and that kind of stuff in a hurry, although I have seen that on occasion and it's not a good thing to see. But generally speaking, some of the birds of these turkeys particularly may have blood in the mouth, and so it kind of might scare you and think, well, I've got a really bad disease. And so you need to have those checked out to make sure that you don't have an influenza problem or something like that. And sick birds tend to stay along the walls. You've seen that. So here we have a case of, this is the heart, and you can see the inflammation on the heart. Again, a lot of vascularity there. And in the muscles, you'll start seeing this bruising or these hemorrhage areas in the muscle too. Now, this is not a very good picture, but this is a lung. And if you remember, that lung that I showed you earlier is bright orange. This is consolidated. It's starting to become a gray color. The lungs are often infected in turkeys. In fact, a nickname for fowl cholera in turkeys is the left lung disease. And if you shell the lung out, this is exactly what it would look like. And this is where the ribs would be. This is very consolidated. It's leathery. It's just like a football. You could throw this pass for a touchdown on this lung. And so it's easy to appreciate that it's really wet. How is oxygen going to go down inside there and the bird be able to breathe? And they don't. They have a really bad pneumonia and they die. So in respiratory sense, this is a disease that causes problems in the respiratory system. In other types of birds, it may not be quite the respiratory system it is in the pheasants, or in the turkeys, although it can be. Now, this is a pheasant, and you can appreciate, again, from your anatomy webinar, that this is the spleen, and it's very reactive. So it's reacting to something. That pasteurella is getting down in there and causing the spleen to increase in size. Now, oftentimes in pheasants, you don't have the football lung. You have a lot of hemorrhage in the lung. So here's a normal color of a lung, and then here's some hemorrhage that's coming down on that other lobe. And so hemorrhage is often a hallmark of pasteurella multisite infections in game birds. And you can get what's classically called the cornmeal liver with this, and the liver gets large and turgid, and you see these little white spots in here. It's not always the case in turkeys, particularly, that you get this cornmeal liver look. It's almost more like a large turgid liver, and if you try to break it, it breaks pretty easily. It's very friable. Just a word of warning: if you're digging around in your turkeys and you see a large liver, particularly if it's kind of cherry colored, and definitely not the brown color that it should be somewhat careful, because that's an indication that there could be a erysipelas problem there too, and that's a zoonotic disease that can cause you some problems. You can get infection in the skin, or if you've got cuts or something like that. So be careful on that. And fowl cholera can also be a respiratory disease in the sinuses too. Again, those infraorbital sinuses have a tendency to collect crud, and you can get some swollen sinuses from fowl cholera. So I hope you're keeping in mind all the things that can cause swollen sinuses. And our last major problem that we want to talk about is the syngamous trachea, often called the gapeworm. This can be mistaken for a lot of things, and signs include an outstretched neck, that labored breathing, similar to what we saw with that chicken with the laryngotracheitis, and they have a tendency to lose weight. You'll usually find dead birds present in the pens, and again, that's because of some suffocation in the trachea, and the trachea will be filled with red worms. And if you're not careful, you may think, oh, this is inflammation and blood, but you have to look at them carefully, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The diagnosis here is there's eggs in the feces, so you can do a fecal flotation, and I think we've had webinars on fecal flotations before, and these are very easy to find if they're there. They're a very golden colored, oval shaped egg, and also red worms in the trachea, obviously, are the definitive diagnosis. Now, you've got to differentiate this from other respiratory diseases, and so you've got to at least do a fecal float to see if they're there. And in many cases, you might have to sacrifice a bird or two to open up those tracheas and see. And it's a tendency to give antibiotics because of the symptoms. There's some respiratory systems. They think there may be a bacterial problem or something, and antibiotics are given. That's not so much of a case anymore, since antibiotics are hard to come by. You about have to have your veterinarian involved in it. These worms will attach to the linings of the trachea, and actually the male and the female come together and they stay together, and it looks like a Y. They cause blockage, high death loss is possible. They're transmitted either directly through the feces when the eggs are excreted into the litter. Other birds their flock mates can pick them up, or they can also be transmitted by an intermediate host, such as an earthworm, a slug, or a snail. And treatment is levamisole or fenbendazole. And for specifics on that, visit with your veterinarian. They can tell you what needs to be done. Here's a chucker that's got a respiratory problem. Obviously, just looking at that, it could be a number of things. But if you open that bird up, here we have these worms. And on first glance, that might look like a lot of blood in there. But if you tease them out, you can see that this is not blood. This is a nematode that's in there, the gapeworm. And it's not hard to appreciate with this many, you could have some problems with breathing in there. Now I want to talk about, Jackie, are there any questions? Any questions about these diseases so far?
None have popped up.
Okay. Well, there's a thing called general, again, I'm sorry, I can't see the top of my sheet for some reason.
It says non-specific, unidentified respiratory.
Okay, good. That's what we're talking about. That's good. Yeah, non-specific is a term I don't even agree with, because things are always specific to something, regardless of what they are. It's just that we haven't identified them. So I would rather call these unidentified respiratory diseases, and these occur quite a bit. In fact, in my career, most of the respiratory questions have ended up being this because in chickens particularly, because in cold months, I'll start getting calls that my chickens are shaking their head and they're kind of have this upper respiratory sneeze, kind of like a snick. What's wrong with them? And so this is going to be happening soon. And there's some things that can predispose them to this respiratory syndrome, but they're not non-specific. We just haven't identified them. But if you have a lot of moisture, ammonia buildup in there, or dust, then there's a tendency to close those buildings off a little more in the colder months of the year than what they should be. And they're not getting the ventilation and moving that moisture and ammonia out of those coops enough, then this kind of sets them up. Usually it's just some mild signs, like a snick or occasional head shaking. And interestingly, they often respond to antibiotics, and especially tetracyclines, which makes me think that at least one of these unidentified problems is Mycoplasma gallisepticum, because that will respond pretty well to tetracycline. And as I mentioned before, I would imagine that there's a lot of home flocks that have MG that they just don't show it. And in chickens, they can carry that and not have a lot of problems, but these birds get under a little bit of stress, and then you'll start seeing some of that. So you can kind of be aware of that. Okay. We're not moving onward here. So how can we keep respiratory diseases out? First of all, keep your flocks to yourself. Don't allow visitors to get into the birds. If somebody wants to come over and look at the chickens, then have them do it from a distance. But the important thing is provide comfortable places for them that are protected from wild birds, because wild birds can bring a lot of these type of things in. And if it's not comfortable for your flock of chickens or turkeys out there for you, then you can bet that it's probably not going to be comfortable for them, and there's going to be some stress involved. Make sure that you don't button that coop up too much during the wintertime. You don't want to chill your birds, but you want to get some air exchange in there to keep any ammonia and dust out of there. And the important thing is quarantine any new additions for at least 3 weeks. Now, you read in the literature, it'll tell you a couple of weeks, but you're better off by doing it for 3 weeks. And some of these diseases may have a little more of an incubation period than you think, or they don't show the signs. But the other thing that you want to do that for 3 weeks for, even more than just like respiratory diseases, is for parasites. And treat those birds for mites and lice. And it takes at least 3 weeks to adequately treat them before you put them in with your flock. Because if you take them to a show or something, they can easily pick up some lice or some mites there. So keep that in mind. And do not use live vaccines unless you have a diagnosed problem. If you think you have one and start using live vaccines, you can cause yourself some real grief. And also abide by state laws when it comes to vaccines and how you acquire them and how you use them. So here we have a chicken. What's wrong with it? Any guesses? I probably couldn't tell you any more than you could by looking at that thing right there. But one thing that, as I put this up and ask people, some audiences, they'll say, well, it can't walk. Well, the reason it can't walk is this chicken can't breathe. It's actually a case of laryngotracheitis, and it doesn't have its neck up extended and everything like that. In this case, but it was bad enough that it wasn't getting the oxygen that it needed, and you'd put it up on its feet and it'd keep going down like that. So you can't really always assume that a chicken that can't walk, that it's a lameness problem, that they may have a respiratory problem. But the only way you can tell is by laboratory tests. And so this bird was sent to necropsy, and we found out that it does have infectious laryngotracheitis. So it's not easy to tell. It's kind of a mishmash. That's why you need a good poultry diagnostic lab to help you out. I can give you a little bit of a handle that maybe will help at least show you what the causes are. The environmental causes are more than likely dust and ammonia. And as far as infectious causes goes, this goes clear across the board on infectious causes. Mycoplasma gallisepticum is probably going to be the most likely. And I can't speak for every area of the country and world, but that's a good possibility if you have some especially light respiratory problems in chickens. Some other infectious agents that can cause some problems are Newcastle disease and bronchitis and infectious laryngotracheitis. Find out if they're vaccinated. Again, with live vaccines, they're not completely safe, and they can cause some clinical signs too. And so another thing is infectious laryngotracheitis. Are these birds vaccinated? Did you just add some new additions that you got from somewhere? Did you bring the birds back from the shows? And again, infectious coryza and ILT are possibilities there. And the parasitic one that's going to cause you some problems, as we've discussed, is the Syngamous trachea, the gapeworm. So my final thoughts on this is that even a veterinarian may have some problems helping you out without some lab tests, but you've got to run those lab tests and in some cases necropsy some birds in order to find out what the problem is, so that you can alleviate it or prevent it from happening on your next flock. So with that, Jackie, I think I'm pretty much...
Okay, there was one question that came in. How many of these diseases affect peafowl or other game birds?
Okay, mycoplasmas will, we haven't talked about the other mycoplasmas other than MG, but MS can cause some respiratory problems, but it's not as common. They can infect peafowl, they can infect game birds. Newcastle disease can affect them all. Again, as I mentioned, infectious bronchitis is pretty much restricted to chickens. I think that pheasants may be a possibility, but it's a chicken disease. Infectious laryngotracheitis, as far as I know, is strictly chickens. Avibacterium can get into things like pheasants and chuckers too, as well as chickens, but it won't infect turkeys. And the gapeworm can get in anything. You can find that in pheasants, peafowl, chuckers, chickens, all kinds of stuff. So,
Right. Oh, one came in the Q&A. Can you successfully treat eggs with Tynan to prevent MGMS from transferring from the hen to the chicks? I assume
that's a,
that's hatching eggs.
yeah, that's a very complicated issue, and that requires some sophistication in being able to do that, because in order to get rid of mycoplasmas, you have to hatch those chicks or those poults, and then you have to test them throughout their life and keep them all separate and find out which ones stay negative, and then do that a couple of times before you can say that they're actually free of mycoplasmas.
But
Mycoplasmas
does
is a tough
treating the
one.
eggs with Tynan do anything?
That's part of it, but it's not going to be 100%.
Okay.
And the other thing with mycoplasma too in birds is that they're intermittent shedders, so that not every egg necessarily is infected, but at certain times of the year or the production cycle, you may have a lot of infected eggs.
Okay. Any other questions? What live vaccines are available in the US? Are these being used off-label in showbirds?
Unfortunately, yes. And I know of at least the laryngotracheitis vaccine, and again, that's the worst one. That's one that you need to know what you're dealing with, or you can cause problems. There's Newcastle vaccines that are legal in the United States to use. Usually it's a B1 type, or a Lasota. Lasota is a little more virulent than the B1. Infectious bronchitis vaccines are available, but if you get the wrong one, it's not necessarily going to help your birds too much if they're infected with a serotype that particular vaccine doesn't cover. So yeah, there's things available.
Mostly on the internet, right?
Yeah.
What is the relationship with backyard flocks and avian flu? Backyard flocks, wild birds, avian flu.
Wow, that has really changed. This last outbreak that we had the last couple of years, backyard flocks are a big challenge and a big risk now. In the past, backyard flocks have not been that big of a risk in past outbreaks, but something about this virus has changed. And I know, at least in the Intermountain West, we've had a lot of backyard flocks infected. And the wild birds are directly responsible for a lot of that. And so we're having these independent infections. So it's changed, and that's a whole webinar in itself that we need to talk about, how to protect your birds from possible influenza. The experts are telling us that we may have a reprieve from any of this high path AI for maybe a year or two, but it's likely to come back. So
it has just hit Canada again. Alberta had at least one commercial flock, maybe two, and a backyard flock. And Saskatchewan has been hit commercial flocks, I think. So it is already back. And the New England area, several live bird markets have been found to be positive for avian influenza, which means that somebody's bringing it in with the birds they bring to the live bird market. So if somebody has it, they just haven't found it to test for it. So yeah. Pam
Yeah.
Watson says that over 95% of their AI cases in Washington state have been over the last 2 years were backyard flocks.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It's quite the virus is actually is changing too, to some extent. But boy, I'll tell you, I think that a talk on biosecurity and how to keep your backyard birds safe is really important, because in these last outbreaks and years, we've had a whole different paradigm shift in how avian influenza has affected us, and it's probably not over.
No, no, well, I mean, they're migrating south and they're coming from Canada, and Canada has it. So chances are it's coming south, and when winter hits, we're all going to be dealing with possible avian influenza. So yeah, got to watch out for that. What was this one? No, we emphasize prevention and preventing spread. What are some treatment? There is no treatment for avian influenza.
No, in fact, there's not a lot of treatment for any of these diseases that we've talked about. Vaccination for Newcastle infectious bronchitis, work with your veterinarian on that. Again, if you have a laryngeal tracheitis outbreak and they're not a pet or something like that, your best bet is just to get rid of everything and start over again. So antibiotics can help you with infectious coryza, but again, they're typhoid Marys, and there's nothing that's going to clean those chickens out completely of the bacterium, and so they'll be carriers for life. And the same thing with mycoplasmas.
Yeah, a lot of the state veterinarian's office, when people bring in their birds for something else, they tend to test positive for MG, and they always recommend depopulating. When you eliminate the flock, how long do you wait before buying new ones?
A lot of it will depend on the situation, but most of the things we've talked about here are not going to live very long outside the hosts. And so you get rid of all your chickens, you clean up your litter, get all the feathers and stuff out of there, clean and disinfect your feeders and waters, and maybe wait 2 or 3 weeks and go ahead, and you should be fine. The only problem with that is the gapeworm. You got to figure out, if you got a gapeworm problem, you got to figure out where it's coming from. That's a whole different situation from these viruses and bacteria in these other cases.
Right. Do you think, this is sort of off topic, but avian influenza, do you think they're going to start vaccinating in the US since they're starting to consider it in Europe?
That is a loaded question, to say the least. And
yeah,
there's, my personal opinion is I think we've got an endemic situation. I don't know how much longer you can call it a foreign animal disease. However, until they can work the import-export situation out, it's going to be a stamping out situation in the United States.
Yeah, the politics.
Yep.
And as soon as France decided to vaccinate, then Europe's been cut off from the US and many other countries. So yeah, so that's a hot potato.
Yes.
Okay, everyone, it's almost 4 o'clock. Unless you have another last minute question, let me just check and see what the next webinar is. The next webinar is November 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on designing a small flock poultry house. Again, pre-registration is required. For any of the Kentucky agents that are here, you have to prove that you were here the whole time. So you're supposed to type in the chat box your name and county so that I can verify that you as a person are there and not just your computer. So there's a few of you here. please type it in so I can verify you're here. Thank you, David. Again, you did a great job. As I said to everyone, that these are recorded. The recordings are available on our YouTube channel. They are also available through our page with links to it, all upcoming webinars, and I have finished scheduling all the 2024 webinars. I'm not up to 2025 yet. So up until December 2024 next year, I have all the webinars scheduled out. So if you want to plan ahead for what's interesting you, this same link will take you to past webinars, and you can see all the recordings from previous ones, which includes, as Dr. Frame said, with the flotation, fecal flotations for identification of internal parasites that he did a few months ago. Some of his other ones were the necropsy one. Some of the general disease ones are in there as well. My anatomy one's there if you want to look how the functioning of things works is good too. So so thank you very much, Dr. Frame. Again,
Thanks, Jackie, and
appreciate you coming in and doing it. I will keep the thing open so my agents can type in their names so that I can give them full credit for attending. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you, everyone.
And if I don't see you before, have a great retirement.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Let's see, so I got Tracy Johnson. I don't see Tracy. You're gonna have to register online because you're not there. Meredith is here. Suzanne, you registered late. I got you. Rebecca, you still here? Rebecca, I need you to type in that you're still here. And David Coffey, you haven't left yet, have you? No. David, I need you to type in the chat box, please. Okay, Rebecca's still here, so I can give you, okay, David's still here. Okay, I will give you your continuing education credits for attending. Thank you.